April 1945. Germany was dying. The thunder that had once echoed across Europe, the roar of tanks, the rhythm of marching boots, the triumphant speeches, had fallen silent. Cities once glowing with ambition were now piles of stone and twisted steel. The empire that had sworn to last 1,000 years had burned itself out in just 12. Roads were filled with columns of broken soldiers, gaunt, hollow-eyed men in faded gray uniforms, their rifles slung like dead weight. Among them moved the generals, the architects of conquest, men who had commanded divisions across Africa, France, and Russia. They had once dined in Paris, conquered Kiev, and driven their panzers to the gates of Moscow. But now they were fugitives of a failed dream. Their medals hid beneath mud-streaked coats, their pride buried beneath exhaustion and disbelief. The mighty Wehrmacht, the invincible machine that had crushed Europe, was crawling westward, desperate not to meet the Soviets. They knew what the Red Army did to those who resisted. They'd seen it in the East, the burned villages, the revenge that came with bayonets. So they turned west toward the Americans, hoping for captivity rather than annihilation. When they were finally captured, the shock was almost surreal. Young American soldiers, boys really, barely 20, with clean faces and Southern accents, treated them not as monsters, but as men. Cigarettes were offered, coffee was poured. Some of the generals, still clutching the remnants of their dignity, refused at first, but hunger and fatigue soon broke the last fragments of pride. Within days, convoys of trucks carried thousands of captured German officers through the heart of a nation they barely understood. The journey was long, across the gray waters of the Atlantic, through ports buzzing with cranes and ships, until finally they arrived in America. For men who had spent their entire lives believing that Germany was the engine of the modern world, what they saw next would tear that illusion to pieces. They were taken to camps, places like Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp Swift in Texas, and Fort Hunt in Virginia. There were no chains, no beatings, no forced labor. Instead, there were barracks cleaner than any frontline quarters they had known, medical inspections, regular meals, even libraries. They were treated, oddly enough, with respect. Yet it wasn't kindness that broke them. It was what they saw beyond the fences. Each morning, from the far distance, they could hear it. The steady hum of engines, the whistle of trains, the rhythm of production. They watched trucks loaded with steel parts rumbling down highways. They saw trains with rows upon rows of tanks, brand new, fresh from the factory, each one gleaming under the sun with its olive paint still drying. One general, stunned by the sight, muttered under his breath, "Mein Gott, they build tanks faster than we can destroy them." That moment, quiet, almost insignificant, marked the beginning of their realization. The true power of America wasn't in its soldiers, it was in its factories. The train clattered through the American countryside, an endless rhythm of steel and motion. Through the barred windows of their prisoner transport, the German generals watched a world that seemed impossibly vast. Fields stretched for miles, dotted with red barns and endless power lines. Smoke rose not from ruins, but from factories. Dozens, hundreds of them, all alive, all working. Even as prisoners, they couldn't help but notice the details. How every small town had a rail yard. How every road seemed filled with trucks. And how every person, from farmer to factory worker, was part of a machine that never stopped moving. When their convoy halted near Detroit, one of the American guards pointed out across the landscape with a cigarette between his lips. "That there," he said proudly, "is the arsenal of democracy." The words meant little to the Germans at first. But as the hours passed, as the sound of machinery became louder and the smoke thicker, the meaning became painfully clear. They saw workers, men and women, pouring into massive plants, some of them bigger than entire German towns. Inside those walls, they knew, were assembly lines running day and night. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler. Factories that once built cars now built war. Each hour, parts came together like clockwork. Turrets, tracks, engines, armor plates, all moving on conveyor belts faster than the German industry could dream of. And then came the tanks. One after another, the trains rolled by, loaded with rows of M4 Shermans, the American war horse. Crates of spare parts stacked beside them, fuel drums, ammunition. The Germans watched in silence, their breath fogging the cold glass. One of them, General von Thoma, who had commanded in North Africa, whispered, "We thought we were fighting soldiers, but we were fighting a continent." The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Back in 1942, when Germany's factories were already straining under bombing raids, the United States had just begun to wake up. But once it did, once Roosevelt's call for the great arsenal of democracy echoed across the nation, America's industry exploded. Detroit alone was producing more tanks in a single month than all of Germany's panzer divisions combined could receive. Chicago turned out engines, Pittsburgh forged armor, and from the shipyards of California to the steel mills of Pennsylvania, it was as if the entire nation had become one vast war machine. For every German tank destroyed, America could build 10 more. For every bomber lost, another 20 took off from Kansas airfields. The German generals sitting on that train began to understand a truth they had long ignored. No matter how skilled their soldiers, how advanced their tactics, or how fierce their spirit, they had been fighting a war that could never be won. Later that night, in the quiet of their camp barracks, one officer wrote in his diary,
Our engineers built masterpieces. Their engineers built miracles of quantity. Perhaps that is the greater genius, not to create the perfect weapon, but to create enough of them to win. The next morning, a guard handed them newspapers printed in bold headlines, 100 Shermans a day rolling out of U.S. factories. Some laughed bitterly, some stayed silent, but one general, a man who had once shaken hands with Rommel himself, just stared at the paper for a long time and said softly, "Then the war was already lost before Stalingrad ever began."
The train finally came to a halt, somewhere deep in the American countryside. The exact location unknown, fenced in, quiet, efficient. The prisoners were led off in small groups, each escorted by polite but firm guards. The camp didn't resemble a prison at all. There were no barbed wire screams, no guard towers bristling with guns. Just rows of wooden barracks, a parade ground, and a flag that swayed lazily in the breeze. The air smelled of pine and coffee. The German generals exchanged wary glances. It was too orderly, too calm. Some suspected deception. Others wondered if it was a trick meant to weaken their discipline. But as days passed, the truth became clear. They were being studied, not punished. Each morning, uniformed American officers arrived at the camp. Not soldiers, but men who spoke perfect German, wore clean suits, and carried clipboards instead of rifles. The Germans soon learned the name of the place, whispered among guards, Fort Hunt, Virginia, known to a select few as P.O. Box 1142. It was no ordinary POW camp. It was an intelligence center. The Germans called it Das Camp der Fragen, the camp of questions. Inside its quiet rooms, interrogations weren't done with threats or beatings, but with charm, conversation, and precision. A former Panzer commander recalled being offered a cup of black coffee, American cigarettes, and a chair by the window before being asked the first question. "Tell us, General, how long can Germany still produce tanks?" He tried to lie at first, of course, but when the American casually pulled out a folder filled with aerial photos of German factories, rail yards, and depots, all neatly labeled and dated, the general froze. They knew everything. Every plant, every output figure, every supply line. The American smiled politely. "We've been watching since 1942. Day by day, the German officers began to realize just how much the Americans understood, not just about the war, but about Germany itself. The interrogators showed them production graphs comparing Allied and Axis manufacturing. One chart made several officers go pale. In 1944, while Germany managed to produce roughly 5,000 tanks, the U.S. alone had built over 20,000, and that didn't include Britain or the Soviets. Aircraft production told the same story. For every Messerschmitt Bf-109 rolling out of a battered German hangar, America sent 10 P-51 Mustangs into the sky. The more they saw, the quieter they became. Their pride in the precision of German engineering, once a source of national arrogance, now felt like a cruel joke. They had built perfection. America had built victory. One evening, General von Mellenthin, a brilliant strategist who had written essays on armored warfare, sat with a cup of coffee in the dim mess hall. An American officer, perhaps sensing his thoughts, asked, "What surprises you most, General?" The German stared into the cup and said slowly, "That you do not seem to hate us. You treat us as equals, and yet you have beaten us in every way that matters. We built machines. You built a nation." The officer didn't respond. He only nodded, left the cup, and walked away. The general never forgot that moment. For the first time, the captured German elite began to grasp the scale of what they had truly faced, a democracy that had learned how to fight like an empire, and a people who had turned their entire way of life into an engine of war. That night, as the camp lights flickered off one by one colonel whispered to another, "If they can build 100 tanks a day in peace, imagine what they can do if they ever feel truly threatened again." The other man didn't answer. He simply lay back, staring at the ceiling, realizing that their war had been over long before Berlin fell. By midsummer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, the Reich was dust, and across the ocean, in the quiet corners of America, its defeated architects sat behind fences, not in chains, but in reflection. Many of them were restless, curious, and in truth deeply unsettled. What they had seen so far, the factories from afar, the endless trains, was enough to wound their pride. But what they were about to see next would shatter it entirely. A select group of high-ranking prisoners were told they would be taken on a transport, no details given. Under escort, they were driven in jeeps through neat American roads, past green fields and busy towns. People went about their lives, laughing, shopping, working, as if war were some distant rumor. The generals couldn't believe the contrast. Back home, German cities were ruins of ash. Here, it was as if the war had barely touched the soil. Hours later, they reached the outskirts of Detroit, and there it began. The first thing they noticed was the sound, a deep, unending thunder that rolled through the ground itself. The air smelled of oil, iron, and electricity. Smokestacks pierced the sky in black columns, each one marking another plant, another forge, another heartbeat in America's vast industrial body.
Their convoy stopped at a massive complex surrounded by rail lines and warehouses. Above the gates hung a simple sign, Ford Motor Company, War Production Division. Inside, what they saw defied belief. Assembly lines stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of workers, men in overalls, women with bandanas and goggles, moved in perfect rhythm. Sparks rained from welding torches. Cranes lifted engine blocks like toys, and rolling off the belts, one after another, were tanks. M4 Shermans, painted olive green, fresh, flawless, identical. Every 10 minutes, another completed tank rumbled forward, its tracks gleaming, its machine guns wrapped in factory paper.
The German generals stood frozen. They had seen tank factories before, but never this. In Germany, each tank was a masterpiece, hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen. It took weeks, sometimes months to finish. Every component was custom-made, every part adjusted by hand. They were works of art, but art does not win wars. Here, in America, tanks were not built. They were born, like a mechanical species reproducing itself at an industrial pace. One officer leaned close to another and whispered, half in awe, half in despair, "Sie bauen sie wie Autos. They build them like cars." Their guide, an American major with a calm voice, turned and said almost casually, "About 100 of these roll out every day, gentlemen. Sometimes more when we're ahead of schedule." The words hit like artillery. 100 tanks a day. 36,000 tanks a year. For the first time, even the proudest among them realized there was no tactical genius that could have overcome that. No blitzkrieg, no Tiger tank, no miracle weapon. They had been fighting not just an army, but an economy that dwarfed their entire continent. They were then taken to another plant, the Willow Run Bomber Plant, known among Americans as the Grand Canyon of production. It was so vast that workers rode bicycles between stations. Every 63 minutes, a brand new B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line. The Germans watched from a balcony as one bomber's wings were fitted, engines bolted, and cockpit glass installed, all in less than an hour. General von Thoma gripped the railing, speechless. He finally muttered, "We thought we had time. We thought we could outlast them. But this..." He trailed off, unable to finish. Later that day, the convoy returned to the camp. The generals didn't speak. The hum of engines from the factories still echoed in their heads. That night, none of them could sleep. Some wrote in journals. Others stared silently out the window, watching the American stars glow above a land that had never known bombardment. and slowly the truth settled over them like a fog. Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield. It had been defeated on the assembly line. Days turned into weeks inside the camp, and the German generals found themselves in a strange kind of captivity, one without cruelty. They had prepared for humiliation, for propaganda, for interrogations filled with threats and hatred. But what they encountered instead felt almost impossible to comprehend. Their guards, many barely old enough to shave, treated them with respect. They called them sir, offered them coffee, and even played chess or baseball with them when duties were light. To men raised in the harsh discipline of Prussian command, this kindness was more unsettling than anger. One afternoon, as the sun sank low over the barracks, General von Mellenthin sat outside smoking when a young American sergeant approached. The soldier was from Iowa, 19, polite, curious. He asked the general what Germany had been like before the war. For a moment, von Mellenthin didn't answer. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not as a conqueror or a captive, but as a man. They talked for an hour. The boy spoke of home, of cornfields, of baseball, of his mother's cooking. When the conversation ended, von Mellenthin stared silently at the fading sky. He realized with quiet dread that this ordinary goodness, was something Germany had lost long ago. That night, during dinner in the officers' mess, he told his fellow prisoners, "They are not fighting us with hatred. They are defeating us with decency." The room went still. Even the most hardened among them, men who had once commanded tank corps or SS divisions, could not deny what they felt. The Americans were efficient, disciplined, and powerful, but they were not brutal. They had no need to prove themselves superior. They already were. Over the following days, the German generals began to notice things they had never imagined an enemy could possess. The guards joked freely with their officers. African-American soldiers served alongside white ones, not as equals yet, but together, in a way that unsettled men raised under Hitler's creed of racial hierarchy. The camp doctors treated wounded German prisoners with the same care as their own troops. And when news arrived that the United States was sending food shipments to starving German civilians in Europe, even while the ashes of Dachau and Buchenwald were still cooling, something inside the captured officers broke. One of them, General Hans Kramer, wrote in his secret diary that night, "They feed us, though we destroyed their ships. They heal us, though we bombed their towns. Perhaps this is their secret weapon, the ability to build and forgive at the same time." Weeks later,
An American officer visited their barracks carrying a set of photographs, not of factories or weapons, but of people. Rows of young women riveting bomber wings, children gathering scrap metal, farmers harvesting food under banners reading "For Victory." He laid the photos on the table and said simply, "That's how we won." The Germans stared at the pictures. They saw the faces of a nation that had turned every ordinary citizen into a soldier of production, not through fear, not through orders shouted from podiums, but through belief. And that was something Nazi Germany had never achieved. When the officer left, silence lingered in the room. Then General von Thoma spoke quietly. "We taught our people to obey. They taught theirs to believe. That is why they are free and why we are here." For the first time, the defeat didn't feel like the end of a war. It felt like the end of an idea.
Autumn came to the camps quietly. The trees turned gold. The air grew still, and with it came a strange peace the generals had never known. The sound of drills and engines faded. There were no orders to give, no maps to study, no more wars to plan. For the first time in their lives, they had time to think. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, small groups of officers gathered by the fence lines, talking in low voices, not about strategy or honor, but about meaning. Some still clung to pride. They blamed Hitler's madness, the collapse of Allies, the bombing campaigns that crushed their factories. But others, quieter, humbler, began to see the truth more clearly with each passing day. General von Mellenthin often sat with von Thoma, their conversations long and heavy. One evening, von Thoma said softly, "Do you remember how we laughed when Goebbels said America had no soul, that they were slaves to money and comfort? We believed that. And yet, look around us. These people built more tanks, more planes, more ships, not because they were forced to, but because they believed it mattered. They fight without hate, they build without pride, and they forgive without weakness. That is strength." Von Mellenthin nodded slowly, staring beyond the fence toward the fading light. "Perhaps," he murmured, "we never stood a chance, not because they made more machines, but because they made better men." Weeks later, as repatriation began and the prisoners were prepared to return to a broken homeland, the camp commander gathered the generals one last time. He shook each man's hand, no ceremony, no arrogance, just a simple gesture of respect. "The war's over," he said quietly. "Make sure it never happens again." When the German officers finally sailed home, they looked back at the American coastline, not with hatred, but with something closer to wonder. Behind them lay a nation that had shown them what real power looked like. Not domination, but dignity. They had seen the factories, yes, the endless lines of Shermans rolling off Detroit's belts, the bombers born every hour, the trains loaded with victory. But the real revelation had been something else. The realization that America's greatest weapon wasn't its steel or its firepower. It was its heart. And as their ship cut through the Atlantic waters, one of the generals whispered to another, "Now I understand. You cannot defeat a nation that believes in both freedom and mercy." In the end, the war had ended not just in surrender, but in understanding. The men who once led the armies of a dictator returned to their homeland humbled, forever haunted by the memory of a faraway land that built 100 tanks a day and never lost its humanity. And that is the incredible true story of how German POW generals saw the United States' unmatched industrial might and realized they never stood a chance. A story not just of war and weapons, but of what truly wins wars: belief, unity, and compassion. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden chapters of World War II. Your support helps bring more forgotten stories like this to life. Until next time, this is Storyteller, signing off. Stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, history isn't just what happened, it's what we learn from it.